right. Once again, God is great. Let's call Isaiah chapter 16 a throne in this chapter that goes on to tell us more about the destruction of Moab. Beginning in verse 1, talking more about the remnant, it's going to say, this time, send the lamb to the ruler of the land. And that kind of confused me and still kind of does. I'm not sure exactly what it means, but I do know that the fact that God seems to have a heart for Moab, that's going to be mentioned at least another 2 times in this chapter, may have something to do with the fact that Ruth was a Moabitess, a woman who has almost an entire book of the Bible, a short book, but it's still an entire book devoted to her story and her loyalty to her mother-in-law, Naomi, when they both fell on hard times. And so it may be that because Ruth did not simply have a book of the Bible devoted to her, but she also ends up in the lineage of Christ himself, there may be some special connection to Moab that God feels even as they are facing their destruction. Remembering that even going back to Abraham, the Moabites were the descendants of his nephew Lot in his attempts to essentially recover or pick up the pieces after the tragedy of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so God may have a heart that goes back all the way to the origins of his covenant or his promise to Abraham and the traveling or the sojournings that Lot made with Abraham. The Bible noting that even though Lot made a poor choice of real estate, camping or pitching his tent near Sodom and Gomorrah, he was still described as a righteous man. With that, though, at this point, the Moabites are now refugees, as verse 2 will say, like fleeing birds, like a scattered nest, so are the daughters of Moab at the fords of the Arnon. But as we mentioned in the last chapter, those to whom the refugees of Moab are going to flee, it's going to seem to be the children of Israel, specifically Judah, are going to be commanded in verses 3 and 4 to give counsel and justice to those refugees and to give them shelter and not simply confine them, but to let their outcast sojourn among them. Because it is going to seem once again that the destruction of Moab is going to come with compassion, and not just compassion, it had a purpose. It's not just arbitrary vindictive destruction, because verse 5 is going to say, then a throne will be established in steadfast love, and on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness. Helping us to understand that in verses 6 on through roughly 11, I think, about 11, the thing that seems to be standing in the way of establishing that throne may have to do with Moab, because verse 6 is going to literally say, we have heard of the pride of Moab, how proud he is, of his arrogance, his pride, and his insolence, and his idle boasting. He is not right. Like we said, those next few verses are going to go on to talk about the way in which it seems that in order to establish the justice that we saw in chapter 5, it's going to be necessary to move Moab out of the way. And that's exactly what it seems that God has done, even though verse 9 is going to say he has done it with tears, or it's going to say he seemed to have done it with tears. And verse 11 is going to again remind us, therefore my inner parts moan like a lyre for Moab, and my inmost self for Kir Hareseth. As verse 12 is going to go on to say that they will offer up prayers in their distress to those who they presumably gave credit for their success, only to find that they are not going to answer them. Going on to say, however, that God is still going to leave them a remnant in verses 13 and 14. But much like we said in the last chapter, that remnant is going to seem to be left feeble and worn out by the ordeal that they have just been through. With the thing that most caught my attention quite possibly being that throne established in verse 5, where in verses 4 and 5 it's going to say, when the oppressor is no more, verse 5, then a throne will be established in steadfast love. One seated on it, of course, in the tent of David, but beyond that, the things that most caught my attention were the fact that the one seated on it will judge and seek justice. Those are things we've heard before, but the thing that caught my attention as being unique this time is the way in which they are swift to do righteousness, which reminded me of the way in which an environment can become completely frustrating when you have to struggle to agree on basic facts. Understanding the way in which we have mentioned in the past the term gaslighting. That term 4, pretending that obvious truth ain't so obvious. And understanding the way that gaslighting, denial, and evasiveness can flat out drain the energy from an environment. This chapter seems to be describing how God is moving Moab out of the way to make way for a king that's simply eager and swift to do what's right.